So welcome to Voices with Vervaeke. I'm joined by my guest, Tyler Hollett.
Hollett.
Hollett, thank you. I've just met Tyler recently, and I met him through a Discord server that has been set up for people who are interested in my work. I wanted to talk to Tyler because when I had some conversations with him, he was saying some very insightful things about this whole growing movement around these communities that are taking shape on Discord servers and networks of them. I think this is a very important phenomena. And first of all, if we could educate some people on it who might not know about it, and I'm just learning about it myself, and also to, again, try and explore maybe some of the philosophical implications of this. It's not just a new technology. It seems like a new way of relating, a new way of community building. Anyways, I'm saying too much. So Tyler, why don't you say a bit about yourself and, start to unpack, maybe in an introductory manner, what these Discord servers are and what you see them doing, etc.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great point there at the end. Even the fact that what we're doing right now, this kind of somewhat long form capacity to really get into the details of what we want to discuss and to not overly produce the content, right? To dive immediately into it, kind of expose it and unfold it as we're doing it in the process. From like where you are, University of Toronto, Marshall McLuhan, right?
Right, yeah.
Message. It's this, the very form of what we are doing here, I think, has an impact on it. And that, all right, so yeah, how I intersect in this historically, let's say.
Right.
I'm a single father and two boys. I think I've become that as the result of some of the turbulence that is a part of the meaning crisis, right? The dissolution of the family as a result of a lack of a kind of bedrock that produced a teleology of the family as a unit of culture, as a unit of being. And also some ancillary problems with the way that we process all of the difficulties in our environment. I think, okay, so personally, myself, I suffer from a series of autoimmune diseases.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And well, thank you. It's been both a blessing and a curse, though, as I think all things are, if you look at them from the right perspective. They afford, I think, a kind of chaos from which you can spin up something new, right? So, to that end, I've I think been in the mindset of trying to uncover what it is that caused this in my own life, right? And during that process, I looked into diet, right? I looked into trying to understand what would be the underlying nature, the physical causation of my disease. I looked into some psychology and cognitive science to understand why it is that men and women fight, right? And I think where I ended up was a kind of very holistic view that tried to take into account all of the ways in which these very complicated systems interact. In particular, systems like you and I, like my ex-wife and I, right? And that study led me directly to people like Jordan Hall, then Jordan Greenhall, in fact. And I found much of what he said in the tech sector quite relevant to my own attempts to understand the world at the time.
Yeah, Jordan's very insightful.
Incredibly, and very kind as well.
Yeah.
Both he and Daniel have been very kind and
Daniel Schmachtenberger is who you're referring to.
Correct, yeah. Yeah. And I think, not to jump ahead too quickly, I suppose, but in contact with that world, in contact with the work that's being done that I was completely unaware of, people in the world that were moving about in ways and understanding it in ways that I had never even dreamed of. The kinds of dynamical systems thinking that you can begin to analyze and understand the motions in the world that is incredibly powerful. So yeah, I came across this information, I came across these thinkers, and I've reached out to them at each case, I think. And I've tried to have a deeper understanding. I'm really here to learn. I want to learn how all this functions, right?
Right, right,
And
right.
try to influence it in a positive manner. I think that's like my deep telos at the moment. So yeah, that's my historical thread and how I interjected here. Since that time, I've noticed that, so it maybe the definition of Discord, it's a social
Yeah,
network.
please.
It's a application that people can gather on and discuss in real time, in both video and audio, and share multimedia content in a stream form, kind of like a Facebook feed. But the possibilities that it's affording this real-time community development that's quite ephemeral, in fact, where the bonds are not one of locality, right? They're not geographically defined. There's
Yeah.
something more like reputationally defined, which is inherent in the manner in which you communicate.
Right, right, right.
So again, the medium is the message.
Right, right.
And so what we're all having to learn is how to, we're trying to level up our communication capacity so that we
Right,
can,
right, right, right.
we can Socratically and in Dialogos, right, learn from each other what we really are and what we're really searching for.
Excellent.
So that process is being afforded by these platforms like Discord. It's also producing something kind of tangential to another already like very dominant hierarchical structure, which seems to be at the present moment failing itself in a very particular sets of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk about that too, but maybe that answers the question.
No, that answered the question well. I'm actually intrigued about the last thing you said, because you were implying that you think the Discord are restructuring, I think, as opposed to a hierarchical structure, some alternative kind of structuring of society and community building is forming. And do you think, does this mean that something like a new culture is emerging?
Oh, for sure.
Okay, so say more
We
about
know that new culture has been emerging for a long time.
that.
There are always several sets of cultures that are integrating themselves, kind of
Yeah,
making
well
motions.
said, well said, yeah.
Right, they're passing between each other. There's at the very least there's this very interesting high-level separation between child culture and adult culture, right?
Right, right, right.
And like very specific, like interesting things that only get passed in one and the other, right? Like hopscotch. No adults play hopscotch anymore.
Right, right,
Why
right,
is it? She's like, it's a perfectly distinct cultural element that's only transmitted in that layer. Likewise for something like gaming culture, which is where Discord comes from, in fact.
Mm.
But there's always been a kind of distinct element of it's almost like a neoteny, right? It's almost like a continuance of the desire to continue playing games in the face of what is almost like just like a salient rejection by the current structure of the world, right?
So
And I think what that does is it prevents the kind of crystallization that usually occurs in the presence of a culture that you agree with. And you kind of maintain this like childlike sense of continually looking and searching. It's you want to open up the search space so you can afford yourself more wonder and more ability to find something that may actually work.
Okay, so let's slow down on that, because that's a really cool point. I like this, the metaphor of neoteny, kind of cognitive and community neoteny. That's really cool, because I've thought of the importance of serious play that used to be at work in religion, for example,
Right.
and trying to stay on that sort of stay in a continuity of contact with that emergence. I think that's really powerful. What I'm not quite clear on is what you're juxtaposing it, what you're contrasting with. You made a couple of allusions to a crystallized and a hierarchical structure.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if you could
Sure,
hash out
sure.
that comparison a little bit more, that would be helpful.
Yeah. So, so in your work, like what we understand about our relations in the world is that in fact, the best way to look at being and moving in the world is something like the interrelationships that we have between self and other, right?
Yeah.
It or thou, or however we want to describe it, depending on our mode of being or framework.
Right.
It's that interrelationship that seems to define it. And kind of sciencely, what this has to represent is some locus in the mind, right? That it's a representation of that attachment, right?
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
And I think that there's some set of substructures or processes that has to instantiate that, right?
Mhm.
This is, it's very akin to like the aphorisms that we have, like you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right?
Mhm.
It represents a kind of a, it's a, I think what it represents is just you finding your niche, the ecological niche, right?
Right.
And if you don't find your ecological niche, um, I think it's, I think what happens is you're stuck in a mode of searching,
Right.
right? That's the neoteny. We know that there's a certain kind of hormonal change that takes place around like age 25
Yeah. Yeah.
that corresponds with like a final maturation of the frontal lobe that
Cortex,
represents like a higher state of responsibility or something, right? So it's something like that. I do think that there's a vast expanse of that in our dominant culture, right? That
A vast expanse of which? Of the crystallization or
of the rejection, sorry, the rejection of that crystallization.
I
Yeah,
see.
this continual mode of wanting to play, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
And that's juxtaposed to a culture. I mean, I'm thinking of the work of Hahn and others that is oriented almost, and even uh, 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 from, that our culture is dominantly oriented around work and even burnout around that. And
Right.
so I'm getting a good sense of this now. So Discord is a place in which people are doing this serious play, but it has a deep developmental import. This is interesting. I think Zach Stein would like this. So it has a deep developmental import in kind of, because the illusion you're making reference to, of course, is in biological evolution. Neoteny, what you can see is one way in which species emerge, right, is so you have like chimps, and then if you take that chimp and its childhood gets extended much longer, you actually get something more like a human being. That was an overly crude and overly simplistic, but just to get the basic idea. So this
Mm-hmm.
ability to adaptively, because there's lots of maladaptive ways of forestalling adulthood, if I'll put it that way. There's lots of maladaptive ways. But sometimes so neonteny is the term for when we extend childhood in the period of serious play such that it becomes adaptive. And one of the ideas behind this is our extended childhood allowed us to internalize much more complex culture, and that, of course, affords human existence. Sorry, I'm just trying to unpack. You
Yeah.
packed a lot into that metaphor. But did I treat your idea fairly, first of all?
No, I think that's well said. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so then the idea is that we might have a cultural, cognitive, and cyber sort of constellation that's creating an adaptive kind of neonteny for us, in which serious play is being prolonged so that we can perhaps ramp up the complexity of the enculturation process, the kind of software that we have to, if you'll allow me that metaphor, that we have to internalize in order to deal with an increasingly complex world. Is that, am I getting what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And more than that, it's allowing, I think, as you're discovering a potential place where you can act as a node of resonance, right?
Yes.
Our sense making is failing in general because of the kind of well, just some of the systemic failures of the broadcast nature of the medium.
Right, right.
It's much better represented by this capacity to directly interact with your audience and to make it more local.
Right.
Yeah, and to make it more of a dialogos and a Socratic method. It seems that that is how we develop the kinds of trust networks that will afford us a true sense making in the social layer.
Oh, I saw. This is very good. I like the connection you just made there. So this new neonteny will actually afford us to restructure the cognitive and interpersonal processes by which we're making sense, and that's very adaptive because it's very needed right now, because the established frameworks of information transmission and knowledge generation are in many ways failing us. Is that also a fair way of putting what you said?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think a lot of people noticing that
Yes.
they are sifting towards the edges. They're finding either a kind of ever increasing madness, right? An inability to rely upon any certain element, right? The fake news trajectory of things. or they're, you know, they're finding from that subsequently a kind of nihilism, right?
Yeah, very much.
And that's certainly the element that, you know, the whole Jordan Peterson IDW movement is kind of scraping from, right? There's a huge undercurrent of that,
Right.
and I think
Go
it
ahead. Go ahead.
represents a liminal layer. Like there's definitely some transitional element to this, that we're moving towards a kind of sense-making apparatus that we can rely upon in direct consequence of being integrated with this technological layer.
Mm, hmm hmm I mean, I've noted the fact, to go back to McLuhan, I've noted the fact, and I think, I can't remember which one of the Weinsteins introduced this idea, but I sort of picked it up and ran with it a little bit independently. You know, the digital campfire. This medium is really weird because it breaks a lot of the standard sort of social grammar. I mean, your face is very large for me right now. And if
Oh, is it?
no, don't, I'm not telling you to move back. That's the point. The point is that, I imagine mine is for you too, or for the viewers. And normally this would, if we were actually physically present, this would convey all kinds of social meaning about status and right. And it would carry all this weird, you know, I just met you, this is inappropriate intimacy and all that kind of crap.
Right.
But the thing about this medium is all of that is just sort of, no, it's thrown away. It's developing its own grammar, right, of how people are. And I was thinking that it reminded me of, you know, the idea of Matt Rossano, that, you know, we spend a lot of time through several species around campfires, and this is like a campfire experience, and that people are lit because they're electronically, they're very intimate. We're not actually spatially located, and it sort of approximates like what you have in a circle.
Right.
And so it goes back to something very primordial, but so it's tapping in some established machinery, I think, but it's also using it in this really novel way, because like you said, and what's really interesting for me is how it's, you know, symbolon to connect two things together that previously weren't connected together. You know, the way this cuts across, you know, in the dialogues, Socrates is very critical of writing, because, you know, it's permanent, and then the person's not there, and you can't talk to them, and he wants to do everything in person. But of course, the problem with that is it's very, you know, it's very impermanent. And so that's why, so Plato's ironically writing the dialogues down, and the irony is intended. You're supposed to pay attention to that. But I was thinking, notice how that divide has been transcended. I mean, this is one-on-one, you're talking, multiple people, but it's also recorded, and other people can then listen. And so these conversations have sort of a meta conversation going on between them, with people moving between these conversations in kind of a meta conversation, which is like, it's beyond that divide. It joins them together, and it affords something really new in how we can interact with each other.
Right. And it's a really interesting playground, because it's I think representing both kind of postmodern tendencies with a kind of trial by fire, try anything, and everything goes, and also a more meta-modern approach where people are searching for the connective tissue, right? That's kind of gathering and making more sense of the whole process. And what you're describing there is very well said. That's I think, just to speak emotionally for a moment, briefly, being embedded within it.
Sure, please.
It's been quite wonderful to watch the direct impact it's had on individual lives, the meaning that they've personally been able to make at the bonfire. It's funny that you say that, and it's we have several channels across several Discords that are actually titled Bonfire.
Oh, really?
And during the late night, we can sit and play music and talk with one another and speak concerning the issues of our soul, right?
Right.
And with this both top-down and bottom approach, where you have wonderful people who have done such good work like yourself, who've put it into the medium,
right,
and it's filtered down through the technology into the minds and the mouths of the people that are trying to make sense of it. And then we gather in small groups and speak of it.
Oh, this is wonderful.
And people have at each moment recovered gems, right? They've found little moments where they, aha, that's what they're saying. This is what it is, and this is what I've been doing my life. Now, to your meta modern point, and to this meta extractable point.
Yeah.
There are people working on tools right now, people that I've come into contact with, where they can take the content of this dialogue right here, right, where maybe 13 minutes in, one person out of 100 had an aha moment, right? And if you can take the transcript and somehow find a way to extract that piece of an aha moment and save it and transmit it in a way that it's recoverable across time, right?
Oh,
There
that's
are ways to
amazing.
do this, and people are working on solving this problem. And I think that it's a fascinating way to level up the capacity that we each have for finding insight.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's
I mean, that's a defining feature of Dialogos, right? As
yeah,
opposed to combative adversarial, where the point is to defeat and gain victory. The point
right.
of dialectic is if you and I, right, can both get to places that we couldn't get to on our own,
Yeah.
right? That's the really central feature. If we both said, "Wow, because of that, I got somewhere I couldn't have got on my own," right? And you say it too, and we don't even have to have the same insight. It just could be that within that conversation, we both come to have those kinds of insights. I think that's the life breath of
Well,
Dialogos.
maybe it's akin to the reciprocal opening, but
Yeah.
when you experience, even if you don't experience the insight directly, but when you experience another person experiencing insight, there is a
Yes. Yes.
mimetic transfer that's
Yeah.
immediately
Yep. Yep.
invoking that desire in
Yep.
yourself, and
Yeah.
then you become searching for it. You
Yeah.
search for it yourself. It becomes
Sensitive for
part
it.
of your
Yeah.
salient landscape.
Yeah. 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 That's well said. That's well said. That's really well said. So I want to go back because it really sparked me when you were, and your gestures were quite dramatic in the good sense of the word, dramatic. You know, the top down and bottom up, because I've been saying about how important that is if we're going
Yeah.
to actually make any any sort of cultural change that's needed to address the meaning crisis. So, what is it like? What is your role in that, like in that sort of top down, bottom up convergence? Like, what are you doing? Like, how are you participating? I mean, because I met you,
But
you were taking a role of
it's actually
facility.
somewhat,
Yeah.
sure. No, that's perfect. It's actually captured somewhat in my name. I don't know if they can see the screen name there, but it's the plebistocrat.
Okay.
Um, the cognitive structures that we need to engender are related to the languages that we use.
Right. Right.
Maybe it's a little Wittgensteinian, perhaps, but
That's fine.
I think it's deeply true that when we develop these similar cognitive languages, these kind of um, structures that we don't have to fight over all the time, that
Oh,
you um, it makes life more meaningful, and we can enter the flow state more readily,
right. Right.
right? And so what we're doing is, at the top down bottom approach, is we're taking elements of two different perspectives, and then at that middle ground, there has to be an exchange of the languages that develop between those two places. And historically, if you take a look at the Hegelian dialogos
Yeah.
uh, of like say civilization and the collapse of it, right? Like
Yeah.
those cultural elements which are conducive to corruption and destruction. I think a lot of it has to do with the kinds of separation, the cultural separation tendencies, where language groups kind of cluster around certain experiences. So, in our modern times, this is more readily felt between something like rural and urban living, right?
Right. 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 Good
Or
example.
male and female living, right?
Right. Right.
These language groups and language clusters become ways in which we battle with each other. I think the lingua franca space, though, right? The middle ground where we communicate the differences between those is really dramatically important. It's a kind of cultural element that hasn't been paid attention to. It's a little shamanic, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a
I
little
like
bit
that.
translational, where you take
Yeah.
in all the cultural elements and you're trying to find a way in which they are conciliant, right? And so plebistocrat is the merger of the plebeian and the aristocratic, right? It's the
Uh,
merger of the world. It's an attempt to bring them together. Yeah.
so,
That's the role, I think.
so in addition to the serious play, there's poesis going on there, because I mean, what you're saying is you're trying to create a mediating language that's
Yeah.
going to like symbol on. It's going to join things together, forms of discourse that previously haven't been talking to each other very much. I do something analogous in cognitive science, trying to create a bridging language
Yeah,
between
that's right.
the various disciplines, synoptic integration. So,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to put these two metaphors together because they feel like they're very close to each other, and I hope you can be able to help me on it. We've got this metaphor of the bottom up, top down, And then there's the mediating realm. And then with, I take it that what you were alluding to is in that mediating realm, what's also happening is this integration between different languages. So it's acting as something that's binding things together, sort of counteracting that centrifugal tendency you were mentioning that tends to like really put a stress on civilizations. Did I put those together?
Yeah. It may even be akin to something like how the radical enlargement of the middle class prevented the ultimate outcome that Marx predicted.
Right. Yeah, that's a nice socioeconomic metaphor. So, what do you I can hear people who have no experience. As you know, I'm novice to this. I just got on thanks to the help of Brett and meeting you and your help. So concretely, like specifically, I know that you're on several of these, and like what do you do? Like you give a quick, like what would you do if you're on there? Like how are you helping? So these are very powerful and important ideas that we're talking about here. But I'm asking you, how do you concretize them into specific actions, practices? Like what is it you're doing?
Well, a lot of it is the conversational approach.
Right.
A lot of it is directing people to a more balanced approach to conversation.
Right.
Yeah, being the middle ground is the receiving end of, both the positive and the negative. It's
right.
It's and it's quite an interesting clash. You can see certain clusters of cultural elements like previously described as left brain and right brain, things like that.
Right.
When they come together in conversation, it's quite interesting, right?
Right.
And there's a really strange mediating role that has to be played by language, that it has to make it apparent that the way that both groups are seeing the world are similar and useful, right? And there's a kind of representative element of that across all sorts of language groups. I think the development of a language represents, some kind of cultural niche, which is, affording some value. And it's true that you can recover that value through some translational process. And I think it's like parts moderation, parts encouragement.
Right.
It's a hobby for me. I'm not being paid to do it. So
yeah, I know you pro bono. I get that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just it's a fascinating and really, like I say, a wonderful thing to behold when people dive into what is true and what is deep, and then recover a better way of seeing the world. It's, I think, a reward in and of itself, but I hope what it does is it begins to allow people who represent what should be the future of the developing world a way to converse so that they can figure out how to do it.
Right.
That same thing is happening in think tanks all over the place, right? In a very regimented and highly ordered way. But I think there's an extraordinary element of talent and skill and time that's being lost in our current cultural space. And this place represents a huge pool of talent, a huge pool of interest. I could name 24 names of fascinatingly strange and interesting people that are working on really cool things. And they could probably never hold a traditional job. And I mean, I could go for another hour or two at least on all the really strange and interesting ways that a platform like Discord and others could be spun up to make ephemeral ways of dealing with the world in terms of new corporations and new ways of doing capitalism, and all sorts of fascinating little experiments that could be produced in this cultural space. But in and of itself, this represents a potential new educational medium.
Yeah.
It could represent, I think, in a very self-sustaining way, a new educational platform, right? Where people extract true education, right?
Yeah.
Like what you're able to do here now, the questioning and the answering and this direct translation, right? There is no inter-exchange. It's affording some turbulence. We get it directly.
Yeah.
That's new. That's something I think that we need to encourage and grow.
And these things are quite large. I know. I mean, my friend Paul Vanderklay, he has one, and I was impressed. Like, we just started one, and there was like 200 and something people on it, and like the first day. I imagine on some of the other ones you're on, like there's thousands of people involved and things like that.
Right. Eric Weinstein and Lex Friedman, I think, are both over 10,000 people now.
Right, of course.
And it's their presence, and when they come in, and it affords everyone direct, close contact with a leading
Yeah,
thinker in an industry.
right.
And again, this capacity to make sense of the world, to ask questions, deep questions, penetrating questions, and
Yeah.
to do that on a human level. It's truly something else. I mean,
Well, I mean, I've done it the first time, right?
mhm, right,
And the questions were good, and it was so exciting, and I was getting into the flow state, just participating in it. Yeah, it was very, very powerful. So I mean, that's interesting because it's both quantitatively and qualitatively very powerful. I mean, if you're reading
right,
tens or thousands of people, and but each person is getting, potential access to very high quality level of discussion and interaction. It's very,
right.
very powerful. Very, very
And we're
powerful.
working on ways to try to make it more efficient, right?
Right.
Because you can imagine like clustering reaction groups into ways where people can monitor reactions, so that you kind of sift the best signal to the top.
Oh,
There are
that's
lots of really interesting ways that you can integrate yourself with the distributed intellect of the crowd.
right. Yeah.
And it's starting to develop. It's nascent, right? You can see the edges of it. It's
Right.
really fascinating the way that people are reacting. And I really think there's a lot of potential here for the early stages of what everybody keeps looking for. This this description of how technology is interwoven with the collective intelligence, right? The self-organizing collective intelligence. How
Yeah.
and what that is demonstrating as is happening here on a place like Discord.
So this holds out something for me that I'm very interested in, very concerned about, which is trying to do something analogous to individual cognition with distributed cognition, which is to transform intelligence into rationality, which is a different thing, right?
Sorry, there's a very loud jet passing by.
That's okay. Can't really hear it very much on my end. So intelligence is this very, as you said, this self-organizing, sense-making thing, but it's also capable of a lot of self-deception and a lot of deleterious patterns.
Well, there's some of that.
Yeah, yeah. And so what I'm interested in is, again, sort of the emergent, what are the virtual engines that are emerging? What are the sets of constraints that are coming into play so that we get this process to be more than just self-organizing, that it becomes self-correcting, and it becomes capable, right, of, noting and patterns that are self-deceptive in some way and things like that.
Right. So some of the key elements are internal structures. So if you define everything in terms of like boundary conditions,
Right.
it's quite clear that there's an inside and an outside. There's a set of rules that governs that which happens on the inside, and then there's a manner in which you kind of translate resources inwards and outwards. Right. So you take in food and you excrete waste. Something
Right.
like that.
Right.
In the marketplace dynamics, it's something like the production of a product or waste. But yeah, so what we're lacking here is a number of different things, I think. One, we're lacking a clear incentive structure. It's hard for people to understand precisely what to work on and how to govern themselves towards it. So
Right.
the teleological element's missing a little bit. And part of that is because of somewhat of a lack of integration of the top-down approach,
Right.
where the nodes of expertise are acting as a way to guide the kind of distributed cognition that doesn't have a clear value structure that represents that expertise.
Right.
Yeah. And the other thing is that systematic internal structure, which allows you to convey those resources in an efficient manner. Now that's starting to develop. It's also in a nascent form. We're working on projects that are tangential to a cryptographic element, something that's in that space called decentralized autonomous organizations.
Right.
And the way that these kind of inform systems of voting. And I don't know exactly, based on early testing, how functional that will be.
Right.
But it's at least an early foray into something that will look like the way in which people can kind of collectively organize their sense making
Right.
on the technical aspect, right, on the infrastructure itself. And so that may be starting to develop too. And I think third-wise, there is as yet a failure of ways to integrate it with the actual marketplace of value, right?
Right.
There's as yet an unknown way to take that product which is made by this, right? So what is afforded by this, in other words, right? Let's say it's recorded, whatever, the recording gets demolished. What you and I appreciate from this now can no longer be transmitted, right? But it exists. The value still exists. It just can't be multiplied.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to do if we can. Because I think, like you said, that self-deceptive element, it represents a friction, right? It represents the turbulent elements of an attempt to reach the flow state.
Right.
All those distractive elements that you have to keep sifting through before you find the real thing. And the ability to distribute moments of insight, moments of value, true moments of value, I think is to counter the presence of that disinformation and disorganized thought and kind of diseased elements, the pathological thinking that we see in our cultural landscape. You need a more rapidly, both convergent and divergent element of thinking, right? It needs both.
Yep.
So
I'm really impressed by that there's already, well, you're at least exemplifying it. There's already a degree of self-reflection about how to bring in, ways in which this whole dynamical system can self-correct and improve and, almost something like aspire. I was going to say it can grow. It can.
Right.
It can afford. Well, like I think it's fair to say, it feels to me like you're trying to move it towards collective rationality and perhaps even collective wisdom. And because.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead. And that moving towards is more like a calling too.
Right? That's what I want. That's what I was looking for. There was something I wanted, and you put your finger on it right there. There's that, that comes up in circling, some of the conversations I've had with Guy Senstock, this sense of hearkening, this sense of the logos that's emerging and that's calling you, and you're trying to be true to the logos, this different, this sense of, maintaining that continuity of faithfulness, of contact to this thing as it's taking shape. Yes, very, very much. Very much.
And it's a fascinating process and difficult to describe. It's difficult to articulate.
Yeah.
And that's, that inability to name it, the inability to put your finger on it or to grasp it is what's, I think your attempt to grasp it is what's so fascinating about it, right? The way it just moves out of the way, right? But it's so fascinating because you've noticed where you've been, right? You've noticed where your arm went in your attempt to swipe it. And that's that self, right? And then you reflect on that moment. You're like, oh my gosh, I missed it yet again.
So it's very much like when you're doing Tai Chi Chuan and you're sparring with somebody and you're trying to do that. And Jordan Hall and I have been talking about this, and we're trying to bring back these notions of, of an older notion of faith, or at least a new notion of faith. I don't know if it's old or new, I can't tell anymore. But that what you find in the Socratic dialogue, how Socrates was very, adept at following the argument, no matter where it went, and keeping his interlocutors engaged. And there was this, and like you say, trying to say what that, is it a reasoning skill? Well, not just reasoning, and it's not just logic. It's this thing that hangs between. It's sort of, it's got elements of reason in it, elements of poetry, elements of myth. It's this amazing kind of thing. And then that's on the sort of the person side. And then there's this, Christopher Master Pietro and I talk about the Geist, the third factor, the logos that emerges, and you're trying to, what exactly that is also something that's constantly, it's on, on the edge.
When two people are doing that, right?
Yeah.
Then you have those two motions, those two circling motions.
Yes.
And that is truly, that comes closest to, I think, when some of the great philosophers would describe philosophia as the way of life, right? Is the true eudaimonia? Is it something? I'm not a philosopher. It's like it's that true being, that true essence of being, right?
Totally. It goes from being something you're talking about to something you're instantiating and participating within, and you're exemplifying a way of life, and you're beautifying it. You're making it attractive to other people. That's all bound up together. So this leads me to the question. I mean,
it's happening on a place called Discord.
Yes.
Right. I love the irony of it. The beautiful juxtaposition of kind of reversal, right?
Well, I found the irony so Socratic, because
Right.
Socrates looks like he's always creating discord because he comes in and challenges and creates aporia, but people get drawn along
Right.
nevertheless in this very powerful way. So as I wanted to say, this sounds so resonant with, convergent with, I'm not quite sure what the metaphorical verb is here, with this project that I've been wrestling with about the religion that's not a religion,
Yeah.
and making it simultaneously scalable and rigorous, having a lot of the functionality that religions had for transforming consciousness, cognition, community, culture, but also not being enmeshed within the axial age, two worlds mythology. In fact, it's a different world we're talking about here. We're talking about this weird symbolon between the interpersonal world and the cyber world. It's a different world. It doesn't fit in the axial world, the axial age mythology. I feel like what we're talking about here, and the way I think it's going to connect up with these emerging communities of practices, like what Rafe Kelly is doing and people like that, it feels to me like this is deeply convergent with what I've been talking about in the religion that's not a religion. You'll have to forgive me. Of course, I'm biased. I'm going to be looking for any signs that will confirm my hypothesis. But what do you think?
Well, in the, to use another metaphor, because I
Yeah,
love them so. In the top-down, bottom-up approach, there's a reason that we reached out to you, right? There's a
yeah,
reason that these two worlds made contact, right? There was the supercharged element of the the electric cloud, right? And then the positive motions underneath, and these little tendrils that send out modes of contact.
right, right,
And if there is something valuable here, right? If we truly demonstrate it, a spark of such power and heat and transformativity and plasma and energy will demonstrate itself, such as we've seen over and over again. Like that one small moment you came in and you demonstrated, not to be too congratulatory for yourself, I think an element of what you talked about there, that ability to move in towards and away from and to deal with some of the people that spoke with you there that evening, that not necessarily had something that was on topic, but you spoke penetratingly, you searchingly, like willing to go into their space and to
oh, thank
question it, right,
you.
to interrogate it. And I really appreciated that, and I was able to see it happen.
Yeah,
And that reflective moment made an impact on me, and now I will try to do more of that in my own being, right? So that was a
yeah,
wonderful affordance that happened in that moment, right? And you can think that maybe 5-10%, maybe more, had that same experience. And to think of the way that it ripples out and the way that cultural elements kind of mimetically transfer, it's something that we need to recover, that we've lost in the I wanted to say the diaspora of our meaning, but I'm not sure what that would mean.
well,
There's
yeah,
been such a fracturing of things that have just splintered off, and we have to bring them back in and recover them.
yeah.
There's a way to do that, and I think it's starting to show up. There's a way to recover what it is to be human, and to really find out what it is to be more than human, perhaps, right? What was meant by that. And I think it's a really wonderful time to be alive.
Well, first of all, thank you for what you said. I deeply appreciate you saying that. Um, I was I was aspiring to do that when I came in, and so the fact that that I might have moved towards achieving that is very encouraging to me. So thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. And secondly, what you just said at the end there, was very beautifully well said. Um, if you'll allow me to compliment you, I think you're an extremely good representative of this emerging thing. You are. You bring with it um, a presence and a personality and a nimbleness and acuity of mind and expression that I think is going to be needed. I think you need to be a little bit more public. You need to, talking more about this, which is why I wanted to do this. I think is very valuable. Like you did what I was talking about there. You articulated it in such a way that it was beautiful. And I don't mean it just in the markets. I mean in the platonic
No,
sense.
right.
You,
No,
you,
and I didn't want to transactionalize it too much. And I well received. Thank you.
right.
Thank you for saying so. I have been in the background a great deal, and I think honestly, there are an extraordinary number of people just like me in the background.
I know
And
that. I know
we
that.
don't seek the foreground so much as we seek to strengthen the background.
Right, right.
In a
And that
very
mediation
species.
place.
There's a middle ground though, right? There is a
Yeah,
middle ground. And I
yeah,
think
yeah.
maybe you found it, right? Like you might be in this little layer that isn't it doesn't overemphasize the broadcast, and it directly integrates with the way
Yeah.
that it makes sense of the world. In fact, it generates that from the work that you're engaged in, just the medium itself. So yeah,
Well,
to that end, it's a really phenomenal process to be a part of.
it is. I think the reason why I might be in that place that you've described is because it's very similar to, I like to try and keep sort of as close as I can to my students. Right. Obviously, I don't mean in any inappropriate way, but I mean having so that there's a sense in which they feel that there's not just a a knowledge transmission relationship, but the potential for some degree of mentorship.
Right.
And so, yeah, yeah, that's very important. I mean, teaching for me is a vocation.
Right.
It's not just an occupation.
Well, so what's that? Is it the Frost poem? Is it Two Tramps in Mud Time, or when avocation meets vocation? There's something about that place where
Yeah,
you found a place where you can do both, right? Where you can succeed in aligning the value of the marketplace with the value of your soul.
yeah, yeah.
And that's a beautiful moment to find. And I think that more people could find it if we afforded them that process, and if we played around with that space a little more. I think we would find there's a lot of good to be had here.
That's a very well. I think that's a good place to end it. That's a very well said. Tyler, this was such a great pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you.
It really was all mine, John. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Like I said, I think I would like to, if I know you'd like to sort of hang back from the center stage, but maybe we could talk again like this. I would like that.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Anytime.
Okay. Thank you very much.